Sydney stood in the corner of the crowded living room, clutching her half-empty cup of soda. The party was in full swing, music blasting through the speakers as groups of schoolmates laughed, danced, and flirted. But Sydney wasn't interested in any of it. Her eyes were locked on one person, Dayton. He stood across the room laughing loudly with a group of friends. His easy charm and magnetic presence made him the center of attention as always. Dayton had a way of commanding a room without even trying. Sydney's heart thudded as she watched him throw his head back in laughter, his unruly hair falling into his eyes. She had loved him for as long as she could remember. From the days they built forts in her backyard to the nights they stayed up talking about their dreams, Dayton had always been more than a friend to her. He was her first thought in the morning and her last at night. But Dayton? He probably didn't even notice the way she looked at him, the way her breath hitched whenever he casually draped an arm around her shoulders or playfully messed up her hair. To him she was just Sydney, his childhood friend. The memories came flooding back. The times he brought her coffee early in the morning without her asking. The way he would show up at her house unannounced just to hang out. How he'd hold her hair back when she was sick and hug her unexpectedly, leaving her flustered. It was the little things, his kindness, his thoughtfulness, that had woven her heart tightly around his. But tonight she felt the weight of her unspoken love pressing down on her chest. It was suffocating. Watching him across the room, surrounded by people who adored him, she felt invisible. Sydney turned to leave the party, the noise and lights suddenly too overwhelming. But as she reached for the door, a familiar voice called out, "Hey, where are you sneaking off to?" She froze. It was Dayton. She turned slowly, trying to mask the turmoil in her heart. He was grinning at her, his dark eyes twinkling with mischief. "I wasn't sneaking," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some air." He tilted his head, studying her for a moment. "You okay?" She nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. "Come on," he said, grabbing her hand. "Let's go somewhere quieter." Her heart raced as he led her out of the noisy living room and up the stairs. He opened the door to one of the bedrooms and gestured for her to enter. "Better?" he asked, closing the door behind them. Sydney nodded, her throat dry. Being alone with him felt both thrilling and terrifying. Dayton sat on the edge of the bed and patted the spot next to him. "Come sit. You're way too tense for a party." She hesitated before sitting down, keeping a small distance between them. The silence stretched, and Sydney felt the words bubbling up inside her. She couldn't keep it in any longer. "Dayton," she began, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his expression softening. "What's up?" She swallowed hard. "I need to tell you something." He leaned in slightly, his full attention on her. "What is it?" Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it. She couldn't back out now. I've been in love with you for as long as I can remember," she blurted out, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. For a moment, Dayton didn't say anything. His eyes searched hers and Sydney braced herself for rejection. Then to her surprise, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was intense, filled with years of unspoken feelings and pent-up emotion. Sydney's mind went blank as she melted into him, her hands trembling as they rested on his shoulders. When they finally pulled apart, Dayton looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Sydney nodded, her cheeks burning. That night he stayed with her and she gave him everything, her trust, her heart, and her innocence. For the first time in her life she felt like she truly had him. But when she woke up the next morning, Dayton was gone. Sydney woke up to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, her heart feeling light, and her thoughts swimming in a mix of wonder and disbelief. The memory of Dayton's lips on hers, his touch, and the vulnerability they had shared the night before was still fresh in her mind. She turned her head on the pillow, expecting to see him lying beside her. But the bed was empty. Her heart sank as she sat up, the realization hitting her like a cold wave. The sheets on his side were neatly tucked as though he had never been there at all. She reached for her phone, but there were no missed calls, no texts, nothing to explain why he had left so abruptly. The night before had felt like a dream, too perfect, too real. But now, in the harsh light of morning, it felt like that dream was slipping away. Sydney pulled her knees to her chest, her mind racing with questions. Why had he left without a word? Was he regretting what they had done? The day dragged on in a blur. She went through the motions, showering, dressing, eating breakfast, but her thoughts were consumed by Dayton. When the clock struck noon, she couldn't take it anymore. She decided to confront him. The hallway buzzed with students talking and laughing as Sydney made her way to Dayton's locker. Her stomach churned with nerves, but she had to see him, had to understand what was going on. She spotted him down the hall, leaning casually against the lockers, his signature grin plastered on his face as he chatted with a group of friends. He looked so carefree, so normal. It was as if nothing had happened. Sydney took a deep breath and approached him. "Dayton, can I talk to you for a minute?" He glanced at her, his expression shifting slightly. Sure," he said, stepping away from his friends. They walked a few steps down the hall until they were out of earshot. Sydney turned to him, her heart pounding. "Why did you leave this morning?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. Dayton sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Sid, about last night?" Her chest tightened. She didn't like the way this was starting. "What about it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "We shouldn't have done that." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "A mistake?" Dayton nodded, his expression unreadable. "We've been friends for so long and I don't want to ruin that. Let's just forget it ever happened, okay?" Sydney's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Forget it? How am I supposed to forget it, Dayton? I gave you everything." "I know," he cut her off, his tone sharper now. "And I'm sorry. But it's better this way. Trust me." Before she could say anything else, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway, shattered. Sydney managed to hold herself together through her classes, but every moment felt like torture. She couldn't escape him, his laugh echoing through the halls, his presence looming large in every corner of the school. To make matters worse, Dayton's sister Mia shared several classes with her. Mia had always been observant, and Sydney could feel her curious gaze lingering on her throughout the day. By the time lunch rolled around, Sydney was on the verge of breaking. She found a quiet corner outside and sat down, pulling out her phone. She opened her messages, staring at Dayton's name at the top of her contacts list. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she couldn't bring herself to type anything. What would she even say? That she was hurt? That she felt used? That she hated how easily he could dismiss her while she was falling apart? Instead, she locked her phone and shoved it back into her bag. She couldn't let him see how much he had affected her. The final blow came after school when Sydney saw Dayton in the parking lot, leaning against his car with another girl. She recognized her from the party, a cheerleader with perfect hair and a dazzling smile. Sydney froze, her breath catching in her throat as she watched Dayton laugh at something the girl said. He opened the car door for her, his actions so casual, so familiar. It was like the night they had shared meant nothing to him. Sydney turned away quickly, her chest heaving as she fought back tears. She hurried to the bus stop, her vision blurred, her mind spiraling. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger, heartbreak, and regret. She wanted to hate Dayton, but she couldn't. She wanted to move on, but the pain was too raw. She had always thought love was supposed to be beautiful, but now it felt like the sharpest kind of betrayal. Sydney's days grew quieter, her world shrinking into a space where she could protect herself. She avoided Dayton as much as possible, but when their paths crossed, she put on her bravest face. "Hey, Sid," Dayton greeted her one morning, his tone casual but with a hint of familiarity that twisted her heart. "Hey," she replied, forcing a small smile. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. You okay? It was a question he used to ask her all the time back when everything felt simpler. Now it felt like an intrusion, a reminder of the trust she had lost. Yeah, I'm fine, she said quickly, the words a shield. Dayton frowned slightly, sensing something was off. You sure? I said I'm fine, she snapped, immediately regretting the sharpness in her tone. Dayton stepped back, his face clouded with confusion. All right, if you say so. As he walked away, Sydney's shoulders slumped. She hated that she had pushed him away, but she didn't know how else to protect herself. That night, Sydney sat by her window, staring at the moon. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. She hugged her knees to her chest, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The memories came unbidden. Dayton laughing with her during study sessions, surprising her with snacks after a long day, and the way his touch made her feel safe. She missed those moments, but she couldn't go back. Dayton couldn't ignore the feeling that something had changed between them. Sydney wasn't just distant, she was shutting him out entirely. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon he found himself walking up to her in the library. She was sitting alone, her head buried in a book. Hey, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Sydney looked up, startled. What are you doing here? Just wanted to check on you, he said, his voice soft. You've been acting different. I'm fine, she said quickly, her tone defensive. Dayton leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Sid, I know you better than that. What's going on? Her hands tightened around the book she was holding. Nothing, Dayton. Can you just drop it? He studied her for a long moment before sighing. All right. But if you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. As he stood to leave, Sydney's chest tightened. She wanted to reach out to tell him everything, but the fear of being hurt again kept her silent. That night, Sydney couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She sat on her bed, her face buried in her hands as the sobs came. Why did he have to be so kind even after everything? Why couldn't she let him go? Her phone buzzed on her nightstand. She wiped her eyes and picked it up, her heart skipping when she saw Dayton's name. Dayton, you sure you're okay? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to tell him the truth, to pour out everything she was feeling. But instead she typed, Sydney, I'm fine. She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, the lie feeling heavier with each passing second. The next morning, Dayton sat in his car, replaying their recent interactions in his head. Sydney's smile didn't reach her eyes anymore, and her voice lacked its usual warmth. Something was wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with him. As much as he wanted to respect her space, he couldn't stand the thought of her hurting. He decided then and there that he wouldn't give up on her. Not until he figured out what was going on. Dayton wasn't the type to let things go, especially not when it came to Sydney. They had been through too much together for him to walk away without understanding what was wrong. His gut told him something was deeply off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of it. Sydney, on the other hand, was growing better at hiding her pain, or so she thought. Her smile stayed in place and her laugh sounded convincing enough. But the effort to keep her emotions bottled up was wearing her down. Dayton decided to confront her directly. One afternoon after school, he found her in their usual spot at the park, sitting on the swing they used to share when they were kids. Hey Sid, he said, his voice soft but firm. She looked up, startled. Dayton, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same, he replied, taking the swing next to hers. He pushed off lightly, the chains creaking as he swayed back and forth. This used to be our spot. Yeah, well, things changed, she said, avoiding his gaze. Do they? He asked, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. Because you've been avoiding me and I don't know why. Did I do something? Sydney froze, her fingers gripping the swing's chains tightly. The words she had been holding back bubbled to the surface, but she swallowed them down. No, she said finally. You didn't do anything. Then why won't you talk to me? He pressed, his frustration evident now. Because I can't, she burst out, her voice trembling. Dayton stopped swinging, turning to face her. Can't what? Can't pretend like everything is fine between us, she said, her eyes welling with tears. You want to act like nothing happened, like that night didn't mean anything. But it did, Dayton. It meant everything to me. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Dayton stared at her, his face a mix of shock and guilt. "Sydney, don't," she interrupted, standing up from the swing. "I don't want your pity. I just need time to figure out how to let go." With that, she walked away, leaving Dayton sitting there, the weight of her confession sinking in. Sydney decided that she couldn't keep living in the shadow of her feelings for Dayton. She threw herself into her hobbies, started journaling, and leaned on her close friends for support. One evening, as she wrote in her journal, she realized that she had been giving Dayton too much power over her happiness. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how to move forward. Dayton couldn't get Sydney's words out of his head. He replayed that night in his mind, thinking about how he had dismissed it so casually, not realizing what it had meant to her. He missed her laughter, her sarcastic remarks, the way she always knew how to cheer him up. For the first time, he wondered if he had been lying to himself about his own feelings. Determined to fix things, Dayton started showing up at her favorite spots: the coffee shop, the library, the park, hoping to get her to talk to him. A moment of vulnerability. One evening, Sydney was at the park, sketching in her notebook when Dayton appeared. "Hey," he said, sitting on the bench next to her. She looked up, her expression wary. "What do you want, Dayton?" "To talk," he said simply. "I owe you an apology." Sydney sighed, closing her notebook. "It's fine. You don't have to." "No, I do," he interrupted. "I hurt you and I've been too much of a coward to admit it. That night, it wasn't just some meaningless thing for me, Sid. I was scared. Scared of losing you, of ruining what we had. So I pushed you away, and it was the worst decision I've ever made." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, not after everything. "I miss you," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Not just as a friend, but as something more." Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't from sadness. "Dayton, I don't know if I can trust you again." "I'll earn it," he said, his tone resolute. "Whatever it takes, I'll prove to you that I'm not going anywhere this time." It wasn't easy, but over time, Sydney began to let her walls down. Dayton kept his word, showing up for her in ways he never had before. Slowly, they began to rebuild their friendship, and maybe, just maybe, something more. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Sydney felt like she could breathe again. Rebuilding their relationship was a slow process, but Dayton was determined to make things right. He started with small gestures, bringing Sydney her favorite coffee, texting her goodnight, and being there whenever she needed someone. Sydney, hesitant but hopeful, allowed him back into her life cautiously, one step at a time. Dayton showed up outside her house one Saturday morning, holding a small bouquet of daisies. "Thought these might brighten your day," he said sheepishly, scratching the back of his neck. Sydney stared at him, surprised. "What are you doing here, Dayton?" "I figured we could hang out. Like old times," he said, holding out the flowers. "No pressure. Just friends." "Friends." The words stung, but she nodded, taking the flowers. "Hey. Just for a bit." They ended up at the park, sitting on the swings. For the first time in weeks, their laughter felt easy, their conversation light. It was as if, for a moment, the weight of their past had lifted. As they spent more time together, they began to open up in ways they hadn't before. One evening, they sat on Sydney's porch, the stars twinkling above them. "Do you ever think about the past?" Sydney asked quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "All the time," Dayton admitted. "I think about how I took us for granted, how I hurt you. I wish I could go back and fix it." "You can't," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But maybe we can move forward." Slowly. Dayton nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Slowly sounds perfect." The more time they spent together, the more the dynamic between them began to shift. Sydney started to see glimpses of the Dayton she had fallen for. The boy who made her laugh, who cared about her in ways no one else ever had. Dayton, on the other hand, began to realize just how deeply he cared for Sydney. Her strength, her resilience, the way she could light up a room. He couldn't deny his feelings any longer. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Dayton stopped suddenly. "Sid," he said, his voice serious. She turned to him, her brows furrowed. "What's wrong?" I need to tell you something, he said, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I'm in love with you. I think I always have been. I was just too stupid to realize it. Sydney's heart skipped a beat, but fear crept in. Dayton, don't say that if you don't mean it. I do, he said, stepping closer. And I'm not expecting you to say it back. I need you to know. She stared at him, her mind racing. Could she trust him again? Could she open her heart to him after everything? I need time, she whispered. Dayton nodded. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. Time passed, and Sydney began to feel the walls around her heart start to crumble. Dayton's consistency, his patience, and his unwavering support made her believe in the possibility of something real between them. One evening, as they sat on the swings at the park, Sydney turned to him, her heart pounding. I think I'm ready, she said softly. Dayton's eyes widened. Ready for what? To try, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. With you. But only if you promise not to hurt me again. I promise, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but they worked through their struggles together. Dayton learned to be more open and honest, while Sydney learned to trust again. They leaned on each other, finding strength in their bond. For the first time in a long time, Sydney felt at peace. And as she sat next to Dayton, their fingers intertwined, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they were exactly where they were meant to be. As Sydney and Dayton moved forward, the scars of their past continued to surface in unexpected ways. Trust was fragile, and both of them had to navigate the challenges of rebuilding their relationship while dealing with their own insecurities. Sydney often found herself second-guessing Dayton's actions. Every time he was late to meet her or laughed a little too hard at another girl's joke, the old fear crept back in. One evening, as they sat in his car after a casual date, she couldn't hold it in any longer. Dayton, she said quietly, staring out the window. Yeah, he replied, sensing the tension in her voice. Do you really mean all of this? Or am I just convenient? Dayton's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sydney, how can you even think that? She shrugged, her voice trembling. Because you left before. Because I've spent months trying to convince myself that I was enough, even when you acted like I wasn't. His heart sank. I know I messed up, Sid. I know I don't deserve your trust yet, but I'm trying. You mean everything to me. I need you to believe that. Sydney nodded but didn't respond, her silence a testament to how deeply her wounds still ran. On the other hand, Dayton struggled with guilt. Every time Sydney looked at him with doubt in her eyes, he was reminded of the pain he had caused her. He wanted to fix it, to make her feel secure, but he didn't always know how. One afternoon, while talking to his sister Maya, he opened up about his feelings. She's trying so hard to trust me again, but I feel like I'm always walking on eggshells, he admitted. Maya, who had seen their relationship evolve from the start, sighed. You can't rush this, Dayton. Trust takes time to rebuild. If you really love her, you'll be patient. I am patient, he said, running a hand through his hair. But what if she never believes me? Then you keep showing up, Maya said firmly. Every single day. You don't give her a reason to doubt you. Actions speak louder than words. Their biggest challenge came when a misunderstanding threatened to undo the progress they had made. One evening, Sydney saw Dayton talking to a girl she didn't recognize at a cafe. They were laughing and the girl touched his arm lightly. The scene sent a wave of insecurity crashing over her. She left without saying a word, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Later that night, Dayton showed up at her house, confused and concerned. Why didn't you come over and say hi? He asked. Sydney crossed her arms, her voice sharp. Didn't want to interrupt your date. Dayton's brows furrowed. Date? Sid, that was my cousin. She's visiting from out of town. She felt a flush of embarrassment but refused to back down. How was I supposed to know that? You didn't tell me. I didn't think I needed to, he said, his voice rising. Do you really think I'd do something like that to you after everything? Her eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to think, Dayton. I'm scared. Scared of trusting you, of being hurt again. Dayton softened, stepping closer. I get that. I really do. But I'm here, Sid. I'm not going anywhere. Please, just talk to me before assuming the worst. After the fight, they both realized how important communication was. They sat down and talked openly about their fears and expectations. I need you to be honest with me, Sydney said. Even about the little things. And I need you to trust me, Dayton replied. I'll keep proving myself, but I need you to meet me halfway. They agreed to work on their communication, promising to talk things through instead of letting misunderstandings fester. Step forward. Though the road wasn't easy, each challenge they faced brought them closer. Sydney learned to voice her concerns instead of bottling them up, and Dayton became more mindful of her feelings. One night, as they sat on the swings at the park, Dayton reached over and took her hand. We're going to figure this out, he said, his voice steady. Sydney looked at him, her heart full of both hope and fear. I know we will. And for the first time she truly believed it. Months passed and Sydney and Dayton worked hard to strengthen their relationship. Their bond became deeper, not just as lovers but as partners who understood each other's flaws and strengths. Life, however, wasn't content to let them grow without throwing in new challenges. Sydney landed an internship with a prestigious architecture firm. It was a dream come true, but it came with long hours and grueling deadlines. She threw herself into her work, determined to prove herself, but it left her with little time for anything else, including Dayton. One evening, as she sat hunched over blueprints at her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Dayton. Dayton, hey, haven't heard from you all day. Everything okay? She stared at the message, guilt pooling in her stomach. She hadn't meant to ignore him, but her work felt all-consuming. Dayton felt the distance growing, but he chose to be patient. He knew how important this was for her and decided to support her in any way he could. While Sydney focused on her career, Dayton started reevaluating his own life. He realized he had been coasting through school and social circles without a clear purpose. Inspired by Sydney's determination, he decided to pursue his passion for community development. He started volunteering at a local youth center, mentoring kids and organizing events. For the first time, he felt like he was making a real impact. When he shared his progress with Sydney, she beamed with pride. That's amazing, Dayton, she said, her eyes lighting up. You're going to change lives. Maybe, he said, smiling. But one life at a time is enough for now. Their growing stability was tested when Sydney received an offer for a permanent position at the firm, but it was in a city 5 hours away. She broke the news to Dayton over dinner, her voice shaky. I don't want to leave you, she said, her eyes brimming with tears. But this is everything I've worked for. Dayton reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Sid, I'd never hold you back from your dreams. We'll figure it out. The prospect of a long-distance relationship was daunting, but they both agreed to try. They set boundaries, planned visits, and promised to communicate openly. The first few weeks were hard. Sydney's new job was demanding and Dayton's volunteering kept him busy. Phone calls turned into brief texts, and visits became harder to coordinate. One night, as Sydney lay in bed staring at her phone, she called Dayton. Hey, she said when he picked up. Hey, he replied, his voice tired but warm. I miss you. I miss you too, she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. I'm scared, Dayton. What if we lose this? We won't, he said firmly. We've been through worse. We'll get through this too. On their 6-month anniversary, Dayton surprised Sydney by showing up at her apartment with flowers and takeout from her favorite restaurant. You drove all this way, she asked, her voice filled with disbelief and joy. For you. Always, he said, grinning. That weekend reminded them why they had fought so hard to stay together. It rekindled their spark and reinforced their commitment to each other. Sid, I've been thinking, he said during one of his visits. I can apply for a job in your city. I love what I'm doing here, but I love you more. Sydney's eyes filled with tears. Are you sure? Absolutely, he said. We're better together. With Dayton by her side, Sydney felt like she could conquer anything. They found an apartment together and started building a life they both loved. One evening, as they sat on their balcony watching the sunset, Dayton turned to her. "We've been through so much," he said, his voice soft. "But I wouldn't trade any of it. You're my best friend, Sid. My everything." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And you're mine." Their story wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had grown together, faced life's challenges, and come out stronger. And as they sat there hand in hand, they knew they were ready for whatever came next.